Imagine having your carpets covered in animal feces or taking a number 2 in public sitting next to your neighbours, all while being continuously at risk of the plague due to non-existent hygiene. What about sleeping on hard stone floors or being tortured while rats eat you alive? These are just some of the pros of living life in a medieval castle. Movies and TV often make castle life seem much more glamorous, like something out of The Crown. But in reality, castles were smelly, dark, and full of pests. Today, we're taking a closer look at what life was actually like inside the tall stone walls of a medieval castle. Hello guys, and welcome. If you would like to hear more historical gossip, then just click on that subscribe button. Now, let's start today's video. If you were lucky enough to be nobility, you might enjoy wine and a rare bath. But for most, it was a far cry from comfort and relaxation, with church and torturing enemies being the main pastimes. In medieval Europe, plumbing was just a dream, so there was no running water or flushing toilets. Waste piled up in big pits under the toilets, turning castles into giant portaloos. Imagine the smell on a hot summer day. No wonder everyone on Game of Thrones seems so grumpy. Plus, without running water, baths were a luxury only the rich could afford. In the castle, the servants dashed around amidst unpleasant smells, lacking access to proper medicine unlike the wealthy lords. Illness was rampant and people relied on home remedies or prayers for relief. Privacy? Forget about it, bathrooms were communal with no flushing system. Your business went straight into a big pit inside the castle. Imagine dropping your keys in there, like throwing them into a septic volcano. Think about how crowded your house gets when a few relatives visit. Now, picture that feeling multiplied by 100. That's what living in a castle was like. Castles needed heaps of servants just to keep everything going, with multiple generations of the lord and lady's families plus their own personal helpers. It was basically living in a bustling, tiny city, all focused on one family's needs. We've all seen those fantasy movies and Disney cartoons where castles have dungeons, right? But they don't show the dark side, how prisoners were tortured, sometimes by letting rats eat them alive. Pretty gruesome, huh? And rats weren't just in dungeons. They infested castles like an old car you can't get rid of. People back then were terrified of them, and for good reason. Rats carried diseases that killed millions of people. Medieval life was tough. Back in the castle days, folks knew how to handle the grind. With a good drink, lords and ladies sipped on fancy wines and brews, while the servants made do with whatever they could find. Turns out booze was safer than water, which was often so dirty it could be confiscated at the airport for being a weapon. In the hustle and bustle of castle life, you might think folks would sleep in till noon, especially after a night of drinking. But for servants, it was a different story. With no electricity, they had to be up at sunrise to get their work done in the dim castle hall. And even outside the castle, if you weren't rich, you had to rise early to make a living, whether you were a merchant, craftsman, or labourer. So early mornings were a must for everyone, rich or not in those days without modern comfort. Back in medieval times, people actually enjoyed taking baths, just like we do now. But getting clean water was tough, especially for those without much money. You can't underestimate the importance of plumbing. Their bathtubs were like giant wooden buckets, which they lugged around the castle for everyone to use. Not exactly the cleanest or most private setup, but hey, it beat not bathing at all. Castles were basically massive stone fortresses, not cosy homes. They lacked insulation, so they were freezing cold inside. The lords and ladies had the better rooms with fireplaces and windows, but servants often lived in the chilly, dark lower parts of the castle where dampness and disease thrived. Honestly, sleeping outside might have been more comfortable. In a castle, there was always something happening, whether it was a feast, holiday celebration, or hosting noble guests. This meant big, extravagant meals were the norm. If you were a cook, you spent all day preparing the feast and then had a simple meal in the kitchen. Meanwhile, the lords and ladies entertained guests at a long table with important people seated at the head and servants tucked away in the back. Meals took place in the castle's Great Hall, where your status not only decided where you sat, but also what you ate. In the castle, the lord and lady enjoyed fancy feasts with exotic spices and rich foods, while the servants had to make do with simpler meals like stew or meat pie. Still, at least they got to eat. Outside the castle, most people were peasants who weren't even allowed inside. They had to fend for themselves and their families, working the land to survive. In a castle, the lord and lady ruled over the land, handling tough decisions and politics. They didn't have time for everyday tasks like cooking or fixing the castle. That's where a big team of servants came in. These servants did everything from cleaning to taking care of the lord and lady's needs. Everyone had a tough job, but at least the lords and ladies could relax sometimes. As we've covered, castles were pretty much smelly stone dumps. To try and keep them somewhat clean, they'd scatter rushes, reeds and herbs on the floors. But swapping out the old rushes for fresh ones was like dealing with a messy crime scene, revealing all sorts of gross stuff like spilled beer, grease, bones and animal waste. So basically walking around a castle meant stepping on a layer of hidden filth. Before microwaves and modern grills, cooking happened over open flames. But imagine cooking in a kitchen made of wood. In the early Middle Ages, that was the norm, for reasons we're still not entirely sure about. So if a stray ember from lunch decided to go rogue, your whole kitchen could turn into a fiery disaster zone. Stone kitchens and hearths weren't a thing until later, helping keep the flames in check. In medieval times, every castle had its own chapel where the lord and lady attended morning mass. The chapel, along with the Great Hall, was the heart of the castle, around which everything else was built. In fancier castles, the chapel might even have 2 stories, so the noble family could sit upstairs and look down on the servants. This setup highlights the harsh social divisions of the Middle Ages. Despite the allure of castle life, it wasn't all glamour. The reality was often tough. That being said, would you really want to live in a castle back then? Let me know in the comments.